My name is Eleanor. Most people who know me personally call me Elle. I am 36 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have quietly run one of the most selective private investment funds in the country, a fund that almost nobody outside a very small circle of founders and financiers has ever heard of, because I built it that way on purpose. I prefer plain cardigans over blazers, grocery store flowers over florist arrangements, and conversations that do not involve anyone asking what I do for a living. My husband, Marcus, prefers the opposite of almost all of that, and on the night his company finally won the award he had chased for 4 years, he stood in front of 200 of the most influential people in the technology and finance world and introduced me as just the housewife. 22 minutes later, they called my name to the stage, and nothing in either of our lives was ever quite the same again. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had someone shrink you down to nothing in a room, without knowing that room already belonged to you. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed at the dinner table, not because we didn't have it, but because my mother believed discussing it too openly invited the kind of attention that made a family vulnerable. My father built a modest logistics company into a regional shipping empire over 3 decades, and by the time I was in college, our family's holdings had grown into something considerably larger than modest, managed quietly through a private trust that few people outside our immediate family knew existed. I studied economics and behavioral finance, not because anyone pushed me toward it, but because I found something deeply satisfying in understanding why capable people succeeded or failed based on factors that had almost nothing to do with talent and almost everything to do with access, timing, and the willingness of someone with resources to take a chance on them before anyone else would. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed at the dinner table, not because we didn't have it, but because my mother believed discussing it too openly invited the kind of attention that made a family vulnerable. My father built a modest logistics company into a regional shipping empire over 3 decades, and by the time I was in college, our family's holdings had grown into something considerably larger than modest, managed quietly through a private trust that few people outside our immediate family knew existed. I studied economics and behavioral finance, not because anyone pushed me toward it, but because I found something deeply satisfying in understanding why capable people succeeded or failed based on factors that had almost nothing to do with talent and almost everything to do with access, timing, and the willingness of someone with resources to take a chance on them before anyone else would. I remember quite clearly the exact afternoon the idea for Meridian Circle first took shape in my mind. I was 23, home from graduate school for a long weekend, sitting in my father's warehouse office watching him review a stack of loan applications from small regional trucking operators, men and women who had built modest fleets over years of unglamorous, exhausting work and were now trying to expand, only to be turned down repeatedly by traditional banks that considered their businesses too small, too regional, too unremarkable to justify the risk. My father approved 3 of those loans himself that afternoon, using his own company's capital, not because he expected extraordinary returns, but because he recognized, from decades of experience, the specific quality of a person who had already proven they could build something real out of very little. Most of the money in this country, my father told me that day, sliding the approved applications into a folder, goes to people who already look like success before they've actually built anything. The people who've already proven they can do it with nothing rarely get a real chance to prove it with something. That gap, Eleanor, is where all the actual opportunity in this world quietly sits, ignored by almost everyone with enough capital to close it. I carried that observation with me for the rest of graduate school, through a brief and thoroughly unsatisfying stint interviewing at 2 of the large investment banks that had recruited me during my final semester, both of which made it clear, in various carefully worded ways, that success in their world depended heavily on cultivating relationships with people who already had money, rather than finding people who deserved a chance to build it. I turned both offers down within the same week, much to the visible confusion of several professors who had spent considerable energy helping me secure the interviews in the first place. After graduate school, rather than joining my father's company or taking a position at one of the large banks that had recruited me during my final semester, I approached my father with a proposal. I wanted to start my own fund, entirely separate from the family name, built around a single mission, finding brilliant, overlooked founders, the kind who did not come from wealth or connections or the right university pedigree, and giving them the kind of early capital and mentorship that could change the entire trajectory of their work. My father, who understood better than almost anyone what it meant to build something from nothing, agreed to seed the fund with an initial investment, on one condition. I would run it under a name that had nothing to do with our family, so that every decision I made, and every founder I chose to back, would be judged entirely on merit rather than the weight of our family's reputation. That was how Meridian Circle came to exist, quietly incorporated under my mother's maiden name, Voss, with a small founding board of proxies who handled the public-facing elements of the fund, while I ran the actual investment strategy from behind a curtain nobody outside my closest advisors ever thought to look behind. Over the following decade, Meridian Circle grew from a modest seed fund into one of the most respected, if mysterious, venture capital operations in the industry, known throughout certain circles simply as the fund with no face, run by a founder who never appeared at conferences, never gave interviews, and communicated exclusively through a small team of trusted directors, who presented themselves as the fund's leadership while I remained, entirely by design, invisible. That was how Meridian Circle came to exist, quietly incorporated under my mother's maiden name, Voss, with a small founding board of proxies who handled the public-facing elements of the fund, while I ran the actual investment strategy from behind a curtain nobody outside my closest advisors ever thought to look behind. Over the following decade, Meridian Circle grew from a modest seed fund into one of the most respected, if mysterious, venture capital operations in the industry, known throughout certain circles simply as the fund with no face, run by a founder who never appeared at conferences, never gave interviews, and communicated exclusively through a small team of trusted directors who presented themselves as the fund's leadership while I remained, entirely by design, invisible. The early years were harder than I had anticipated, in ways that had nothing to do with capital or strategy, and everything to do with the strange loneliness of building something significant while deliberately erasing yourself from the story of it. I spent long nights reviewing pitch decks from founders who would never know my name, structuring investment terms through proxy directors who received the public credit and warm thank you emails that, by any reasonable measure, belonged to me. I told myself, during those early years, that the anonymity was a feature rather than a limitation, that it protected the integrity of every decision I made from ever being colored by my family's reputation or, later, by anyone's assumptions about a young woman running significant capital. There was truth in that reasoning. There was also, quietly accumulating underneath it, a growing comfort with invisibility that would eventually seep into every corner of my life, including the one I built with Marcus. By the time I met him, Meridian Circle had already backed 41 companies, 17 of which had grown into genuinely significant businesses, 3 of which had gone on to become publicly traded companies worth, collectively, well over $2 billion. I had personally reviewed thousands of pitch decks, sat through hundreds of due diligence calls under careful proxy arrangements, and developed, through sheer repetition, an almost instinctive ability to separate genuine substance from polished performance within the first 10 minutes of any pitch. It was precisely that instinct that made Marcus's unpolished, unglamorous presentation at that industry mixer register so clearly against the noise of everyone else in the room. I met Marcus almost 7 years ago, at a small industry mixer I had attended purely by accident, tagging along with a friend from graduate school who wanted company. Marcus was giving an impromptu pitch to a cluster of people near the bar, talking with a kind of raw, unpolished enthusiasm that I had learned, over years of evaluating founders, was worth considerably more than the polished pitches of people who had learned exactly what investors wanted to hear. He was building a data analytics platform for small manufacturing companies, the kind of unglamorous, deeply useful technology that almost nobody in the room seemed particularly interested in, because it did not have the flashy appeal of consumer apps or social platforms. I found myself drawn into the conversation, asking him questions about his customer acquisition model, his unit economics, the specific pain points he was solving, and he answered every question with a clarity and honesty that told me, within 20 minutes, that this was exactly the kind of founder Meridian Circle existed to find. I did not tell him who I was that night, or for a long time afterward. I told him I worked in finance, which was true, and left it at that, because something about the way he talked about his work, unguarded and genuinely passionate, made me want to know him as a person before he ever learned I might be able to change his professional life. We started dating 3 months later, and I made the same choice I had made with every relationship before his, keeping the details of my career deliberately vague, telling myself I wanted to be loved for who I was rather than what I controlled. Marcus, for his part, never pressed particularly hard for details, which I initially read as respect for my privacy, and which I would later come to understand, much too slowly, as a lack of genuine curiosity about the fuller dimensions of the woman he was building a life with. 2 years into our relationship, Marcus's company nearly collapsed. His original seed investors, spooked by a slower-than-projected growth curve and a competitor's aggressive expansion into his market, pulled their support during a critical funding round, leaving him 6 weeks from running out of runway entirely. He came home one night, gray-faced and exhausted, and told me, for the first time since I had known him, that he thought he might have to shut everything down, lay off the 11 employees who had believed in his vision, and admit defeat on the only thing he had ever truly wanted to build. I did not tell him that night that I could help. I went instead to my own team at Meridian Circle the following morning and reviewed his company's financials with the same rigor I applied to every potential investment, deliberately separating my personal feelings from my professional judgment, because I needed to know, honestly, whether his company was worth saving on its own merits, not simply because I loved the man running it. I spent nearly 6 hours that day poring over his customer contracts, his burn rate, his competitive positioning, running the exact same analysis I would have run for any founder pitching me cold, refusing to let the fact that I shared a bed with this particular founder soften the rigor of the review in either direction. The data told me clearly that it was worth saving. His technology was genuinely superior to his competitors, his customer retention numbers were strong, and his only real problem was a temporary cash crunch caused by a slower enterprise sales cycle than he had originally projected, a common and survivable problem for a company with real underlying value. I authorized an emergency bridge investment through Meridian Circle, structured carefully through our standard proxy process so that Marcus would never know the capital had come from anyone connected to me personally. The investment saved his company. 18 months later, that same company, now called Belcore Analytics, secured a major enterprise partnership that transformed its trajectory entirely, eventually growing into a business valued at several $100 million, built on a foundation that, unbeknownst to Marcus, his own wife had quietly reinforced during its most vulnerable moment. I never told him. I told myself, for years, that the timing was never right, that revealing it would complicate the purity of what we had built together, that he deserved to believe his success was entirely his own doing, earned through nothing but his own talent and persistence. There is truth in that belief, and there is also, I eventually had to admit to myself, a considerable amount of cowardice hiding underneath it, because the longer I let him believe a false version of how his company survived, the harder it became to ever correct the record without it looking like a decade of deliberate deception, which, in the most literal sense, it was. We married 4 years ago, in a small ceremony that Marcus's family found strangely modest given what they vaguely understood about my family's background, though nobody in his family, including Marcus, ever asked detailed enough questions to understand exactly how modest or immodest my background truly was. I let the assumption stand that I came from a comfortable but unremarkable finance family, that I worked in some kind of investment advisory role, a description vague enough to be technically true and specific enough to end most conversations before they became interesting. Over the 4 years of our marriage, as Belcore Analytics grew and Marcus's public profile grew alongside it, I watched a familiar pattern emerge, one I recognized distantly from years spent studying how success changes people, sometimes for the better, and sometimes in ways that quietly hollow out the parts of a person that used to make room for other people's complexity. Marcus began attending more industry events, giving more interviews, cultivating relationships with the kind of high-profile investors and executives who could elevate his company's next funding round or acquisition prospects. And in nearly every one of those settings, when the conversation inevitably turned to me, Marcus's description of his wife grew progressively smaller and vaguer, until it eventually settled into a phrase he used so consistently it began to feel less like an oversight and more like a deliberate strategy. "My wife handles things at home," he would say, or, "Elle's not really in the industry, she keeps our life running so I can focus on the business." Or, on one particularly memorable occasion at a dinner with 2 board members from a competing firm, "She used to work in finance, actually, before we got married, but these days she's mostly just at home, you know, keeping things together." I heard variations of that phrase so many times over 4 years that I stopped registering the sting of it, the way you stop feeling a low, constant ache after enough repetition, not because it stops hurting, but because your body simply reclassifies the pain as background noise, something to be managed rather than addressed. I told myself, the same way I had told myself for a decade, that I did not need Marcus or his industry colleagues to understand the full scope of what I had built. I told myself the quiet satisfaction of watching founders I had personally selected transform their companies into meaningful, world-changing businesses was enough, that I did not need public recognition to validate a decade of careful, deliberate work. I believed that, mostly, until the night of the Meridian Innovation Awards. The irony, which I did not fully appreciate until much later, was almost too precise to be believed. Meridian Circle's public-facing foundation hosted an annual awards ceremony celebrating the most promising founders and companies the fund had supported over the previous year, an event I had personally designed nearly a decade earlier as a way of giving genuine recognition to the founders who rarely received it elsewhere, the unglamorous, overlooked builders working on unsexy problems that mattered more than most people understood. I attended every single year, always as a quiet guest seated near the back, always introduced, if I was introduced at all, simply as a friend of the foundation, never once as the woman who had founded and personally run the entire operation from behind a curtain of proxies and board directors who fielded the public attention I had deliberately avoided for 10 years. This year's ceremony marked the foundation's 10th anniversary, and Belcore Analytics, Marcus's company, had been nominated for the night's most prestigious honor, the Meridian Visionary Award, given annually to the portfolio company demonstrating the most significant growth and impact over the preceding year. Marcus had wanted this particular award for 4 straight years, watching it go to other founders while his own company grew steadily but, in his view, never quite dramatically enough to capture the recognition he believed it deserved. This year, with Belcore's revenue nearly tripling and a major acquisition offer reportedly on the table from a much larger competitor, Marcus was confident, in the specific, slightly manic way people become confident when they have decided in advance that something belongs to them. "This is our year," he told me, standing in front of our bedroom mirror 3 nights before the ceremony, adjusting the collar of a new suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion. "Grant thinks we're a lock. The board's practically already congratulated us." Grant Whitmore was Marcus's co-founder and chief financial officer, a sharp, ambitious man who had joined Belcore 2 years into its existence and had, over time, become the primary architect of the company's financial strategy and its increasingly aggressive growth narrative. I had met Grant perhaps a dozen times over the years at various company events, and something about him had always registered, quietly, as slightly off, a persistent gap between the confidence of his projections and the caution I would have expected from someone managing a company's finances with genuine rigor. I had never voiced this concern to Marcus directly, partly because I had no formal role in his company and no obvious grounds for the observation, and partly because, if I am being fully honest, some part of me had already begun quietly distancing my professional instincts from a marriage that increasingly felt like it existed in a separate compartment from the rest of my life. "I'm happy for you," I told Marcus that night, and I meant it, genuinely, despite everything else building quietly underneath the surface of our marriage. "You've worked incredibly hard for this." "I have," he agreed, still studying his reflection. "Wear something nice Saturday. There's going to be a lot of important people there. Investors, board members from some of the bigger funds. I want us to make a good impression." "I always wear something nice, Marcus. You know what I mean." He turned to look at me, and something in his expression carried the particular impatience of a man already mentally rehearsing a victory speech. "Just nothing too plain. This is a big night." I did not respond to that the way I might have responded years earlier, with a sharp comment about the implication buried inside his request. I had learned, over 4 years of marriage, exactly which battles were worth fighting and which ones simply drained energy I preferred to save for the work that actually mattered to me. I let it go, the way I had let so many things go, and I chose, for the ceremony, a deep emerald dress I had purchased for an entirely different occasion years earlier, elegant without being flashy, precisely the kind of understated choice that had defined my entire adult approach to public appearance. The Meridian Innovation Awards took place at the Ainsworth Grand, a restored Art Deco theater in the city's financial district that the foundation had used for the ceremony every year since its founding. 200 guests filled the main ballroom, a carefully curated mix of founders, investors, board members, and members of the press who covered the venture capital and technology sectors closely enough to consider the event worth attending. I arrived with Marcus a little before 7, and I felt, the moment we walked through the grand entrance, the particular strange sensation of standing inside a room I had built, surrounded by relationships I had personally cultivated over a decade, while almost nobody in that entire ballroom had any idea who I actually was. Marcus moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the last 2 years cultivating exactly this kind of visibility, shaking hands, laughing at appropriate moments, introducing himself to people whose names I recognized from a decade of reviewing investment memos and due diligence reports, though of course none of them recognized me at all. I followed a half-step behind him, the way I always did at these events, watching the room with the quiet, practiced attentiveness of someone who had spent 10 years learning to read a room without ever being read by it in return. The Meridian Innovation Awards took place at the Ainsworth Grand, a restored Art Deco theater in the city's financial district that the foundation had used for the ceremony every year since its founding. 200 guests filled the main ballroom, a carefully curated mix of founders, investors, board members, and members of the press who covered the venture capital and technology sectors closely enough to consider the event worth attending. I arrived with Marcus a little before 7, and I felt, the moment we walked through the grand entrance, the particular strange sensation of standing inside a room I had built, surrounded by relationships I had personally cultivated over a decade, while almost nobody in that entire ballroom had any idea who I actually was. The theater's lobby had been transformed for the evening, soft gold lighting reflecting off the original Art Deco moldings, waitstaff circulating with trays of champagne, a string quartet playing quietly near the grand staircase. I recognized nearly every face in that lobby from a decade of reviewing investment memos, quarterly board updates, and founder progress reports, though of course, walking beside Marcus in my understated emerald dress, not a single one of them recognized me in return. It was a strange, almost dizzying sensation, watching people I had personally decided to fund, people whose companies I had rescued from collapse or quietly steered toward better decisions through my proxy directors, walk right past me without the faintest flicker of recognition. "There's Aaron Kessler," Marcus said, nodding toward a tall man near the bar deep in conversation with 2 others. His logistics startup just closed a massive Series C. Word as Meridian Circle led the round. "Is that right?" I said. "Grant's been trying to get an introduction to whoever actually runs that fund for 2 years. Nobody can figure out who's behind it. It's like this weird open secret in the industry. Everyone assumes it's some reclusive old money family, but nobody actually knows." Marcus laughed. "Honestly, it's a little unsettling, don't you think? All that capital, and nobody can even put a face to it." "Maybe the person behind it prefers it that way," I said. "Maybe she thinks the work speaks for itself better without a face attached to it."
She.
Marcus glanced at me, amused. "You think it's a woman?" "Just a feeling," I said, and let the conversation move on, the way I had let so many conversations move on over the years, holding pieces of myself just out of reach of the person who was supposed to know me best. We made our way deeper into the reception, Marcus greeting a rotating cast of colleagues and acquaintances with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 2 years cultivating exactly this kind of visibility. I recognized several of Belcor's early customers among the crowd, a handful of journalists who covered the enterprise software sector, and, near the center of the room, holding court with a particular gravitational presence of someone whose approval mattered to nearly everyone within earshot, Diane Castellan. Diane Castellan managed one of the 3 largest venture funds in the country, a woman whose reputation for blunt, unsparing due diligence had made her both feared and deeply respected across the industry. I had crossed paths with her work indirectly many times over the years, occasionally co-investing in the same companies through entirely separate channels, though we had never once met in person, since I avoided precisely these kinds of rooms for exactly the reason currently unfolding around me. We reached a small cluster of people near the bar roughly 20 minutes into the reception, a group that included Diane Castellan, the managing partner of one of the largest venture funds in the country, and two men I recognized as senior executives from the firm rumored to be finalizing an acquisition offer for Belcore Analytics. Grant stood among them, already deep in conversation, his hand resting easily on one of the executive's shoulders in the particular casual way people touch each other when they believe a deal is essentially already closed. He caught sight of Marcus approaching and raised his glass in a small, celebratory gesture, the gesture of a man thoroughly convinced that the biggest night of his professional life was unfolding exactly according to plan. "Marcus," Diane Castellan said warmly, extending her hand. "Congratulations on the nomination. I have to say, the growth numbers Grant walked us through last quarter were genuinely impressive." "Thank you, Diane. That means a lot coming from you." Marcus's smile widened, and I watched him settle into the particular performance he had perfected over the last 2 years, equal parts humility and calculated confidence. "This has been the most incredible year for the company. I really think we're just getting started." "And who's this?" Diane asked, turning toward me with the polite, expectant smile of someone accustomed to being introduced to spouses and partners at these kinds of events. Marcus's arm came around my shoulders in a gesture that looked, to anyone watching, like affection, though I felt, underneath it, the particular practiced lightness of a man about to say something he had said so many times it no longer registered as significant to him at all. "This is my wife, Elle," Marcus said. "She's just the housewife, keeps everything running smoothly at home so I can focus on the business side of things." He laughed, a light, easy laugh, the kind designed to make the comment sound like a compliment rather than a dismissal. "Honestly, none of this happens without her holding the fort while I'm out here chasing acquisitions." Diane Castellan smiled politely, the particular smile people give when a comment has been offered as charming but has landed somewhere closer to uncomfortable, and said something pleasant about how important it was to have support at home, and the conversation moved on almost immediately to the acquisition rumors, to the growth projections Grant was already elaborating on with theatrical enthusiasm, to everything except me, standing there in my careful emerald dress, having just been reduced in front of the most influential people in an industry I had spent a decade quietly shaping, to a domestic footnote in my husband's success story. One of the executives glanced my way briefly, offered a polite, forgettable nod, and turned his attention back to Grant's projections without another word, exactly the way I had learned, over years of standing at the edges of rooms like this one, that people usually treated the person they had just been told was unimportant. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty matters more than performance in these stories. I did not feel a sudden, dramatic surge of rage. I felt something quieter and, in some ways, more devastating, a slow, sinking confirmation of something I had suspected for years but had never allowed myself to fully articulate. My husband did not see me. Not really. Not the fuller, more complicated woman standing beside him, the one who had spent a decade building something that mattered, the one who had quietly saved his company from collapse before he had even proposed to me. He saw a comfortable, convenient category, the housewife, and he had apparently decided, at some point over the last 4 years, that this category required no further explanation or curiosity. The conversation drifted on around me for several more minutes, Grant expanding on the company's projected growth for the acquiring firm's executives, Diane asking pointed questions about customer retention that Marcus answered with practiced confidence, and I stood there, smiling in the appropriate places, saying nothing, feeling the particular loneliness of being physically present in a room while being entirely absent from anyone's actual attention. I excused myself eventually, telling Marcus I was going to find our table, and I walked toward the ballroom's edge, past clusters of people discussing funding rounds and market opportunities, past a small stage being prepared for the evening's award presentations, and I found a quiet corner near the coat check where I could simply stand for a moment, alone, and let the full weight of the last 20 minutes settle over me properly. It was there, standing in that quiet corner, that Rosalind Chen found me. Rosalind was one of Meridian Circle's 3 board directors, the trusted face of the foundation who handled all of its public appearances, press interactions, and, on nights like this one, the logistics of the annual award ceremony. She had worked alongside me for 8 years, longer than nearly anyone else on the fund's small internal team, and in that time she had become one of perhaps 4 people in the entire world who knew the full truth about who actually controlled Meridian Circle. She approached me now with an expression of barely contained urgency that told me, immediately, that something important was happening. Thank God," Rosalind said quietly, glancing around to make sure nobody was close enough to overhear. "I've been looking for you. We need to talk right now, before the ceremony starts." "What's wrong?" "2 things. First, the board wants to move forward with the anniversary announcement tonight, during the ceremony. We discussed this as a possibility months ago, remember? The 10th anniversary reveal, where the Foundation's founder finally steps forward publicly. The board voted this afternoon to do it tonight, during the main award presentation. I need to know if you're still willing." I stared at her for a long moment, the events of the last 20 minutes still raw and immediate in my mind. "Tonight. Of all nights. I know the timing is complicated, given that Marcus's company is up for the main award. But that's actually part of why the board thinks tonight makes sense. It shows the Foundation's commitment to genuine transparency, revealing the founder specifically at a moment when one of our own portfolio companies is being celebrated. It sends exactly the message we've always wanted to send, that merit and quiet work matter more than visibility." She paused. "But it's your call, entirely. If you're not ready, we push it to next year." I thought about Marcus's hand on my shoulder, the easy, dismissive laugh, the phrase, "just the housewife," landing in front of the exact people whose respect he had spent 2 years chasing. I thought about a decade of standing quietly at the edges of rooms I had personally built, watching other people receive credit for architecture I had designed from behind a curtain I had constructed entirely out of my own choices. "I'm ready," I said. "What's the second thing?" Rosalind's expression tightened further. "The second thing is more serious. Our due diligence team flagged some irregularities in Belcor's quarterly filings ahead of tonight's award consideration. Standard process, we review the financials of every nominated company before the ceremony. The growth numbers Grant's been presenting to the acquiring firm don't match the underlying data in Belcor's actual accounting systems. Not by a small margin. We're talking about a discrepancy of nearly 40% in reported customer retention, and there are 3 large enterprise contracts listed as fully executed that our team can't verify actually exist." The floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. "You're telling me Grant has been falsifying the company's numbers?" "I'm telling you our team found enough red flags that I didn't feel comfortable letting tonight's award proceed without you knowing first. I don't have full confirmation yet, but if this is what it looks like, we're not just talking about an award ceremony anymore. We're talking about a company potentially defrauding an acquiring firm out of what could be a 9-figure deal, based on numbers that don't reflect reality." I stood in that quiet corner near the coat check, the sounds of the reception drifting around us, 200 people laughing and networking and celebrating an industry built, in theory, on genuine merit and honest growth, and I felt something shift inside me, the same clean, clarifying focus I had felt years earlier reviewing Marcus's struggling company's financials for the very first time. Except now the stakes involved not just a company's survival, but the integrity of an entire acquisition. The fortunes of small investors who had trusted Belcor's reported numbers, and underneath all of it, the uncomfortable question of exactly how much my own husband knew about what his co-founder had been doing. "Pull the full report," I told Rosalind. "Everything the team has. I need it on my phone within the next 15 minutes. And Rosalind, when you make the anniversary announcement tonight, I want you to do exactly what we discussed." "I'll be ready." The ceremony began 40 minutes later, the ballroom lights dimming as guests found their seats at round tables arranged before the stage. I sat beside Marcus at a table near the front, a placement I had specifically requested from Rosalind under the guise of Foundation logistics, close enough to the stage that the symbolism of what was about to happen would land with maximum clarity for everyone watching, especially the man sitting beside me, still glowing with the particular confidence of someone who believed the biggest moment of his professional life was still ahead of him rather than already, unknowingly, behind him. Waiters moved quietly between the tables refilling water glasses, and somewhere behind the stage curtain, I knew Rosalind and Priya were making the final small adjustments to a program that was about to change considerably more than anyone in that ballroom currently understood. The Foundation's executive director, a warm, articulate woman named Priya Anand who had served as one of Meridian Circle's public-facing directors for 6 years, took the stage to open the evening's program. She spoke about the Foundation's decade of work, the hundreds of founders it had supported, the specific mission of finding overlooked talent and giving it genuine opportunity rather than empty encouragement. I listened to her describe, in broad strokes, a mission statement I had personally written 11 years earlier, sitting alone in my father's study, determined to build something that judged people on the actual substance of their work rather than the polish of their presentation. This year, Priya continued, her voice carrying a particular weight that told me she was approaching the moment Rosalind had warned me about, marks Meridian Circle's 10th anniversary. And for 10 years, this foundation has operated according to a philosophy its founder believed in deeply from the very beginning, that the work should always speak louder than the person behind it. For 10 years, our founder has remained entirely anonymous, choosing to let the founders we support receive every ounce of recognition, while she worked, quietly, from behind the scenes, to give them the resources and mentorship to succeed. A ripple of curious murmurs moved through the ballroom. Beside me, Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, his attention caught, though not yet with any sense of what was coming. Tonight, on our 10th anniversary, our founder has decided the time has finally come to change that, Priya said. Not because the mission has changed, but because we believe there is real value in showing every founder in this room, every person who has ever been told their work mattered less because of how they looked, or where they came from, or what assumptions people made about them at first glance, that genuine substance eventually finds its way into the light, whether or not it ever asked for the spotlight in the first place. My heart was steady in a way that surprised even me, the same particular steadiness I had felt years earlier reviewing genetic data, or more recently, reviewing a struggling founder's balance sheet at 2 in the morning, the specific calm that arrives when you have spent years preparing for a moment without fully realizing you were preparing for it. Please join me in welcoming, for the very first time in public, the founder of Meridian Circle, Eleanor Voss. The name landed across the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of recognition and confusion spreading outward in every direction. I could see people turning to their neighbors, whispering, trying to place the name against a decade of speculation about who might be running one of the industry's most consequential and mysterious funds. Somewhere near the back of the room, I heard someone say, quite audibly, "Wait, isn't that Marcus Hartley's wife?" The applause started slowly, uncertain, the particular hesitant clapping of a room that does not yet understand what it is celebrating. I rose from my seat, feeling Marcus's hand slip from where it had been resting near mine on the table, feeling him turn toward me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, confusion giving way, in real time, to something between disbelief and dawning horror. "Elle," he said quietly, his voice barely audible beneath the applause building around us. "What is happening right now?" "I'll explain everything after," I said, and I walked toward the stage, past tables full of people whose faces I recognized from a decade of investment memos and quarterly reports, past Grant Whitmore, whose expression had gone rigid and pale in a way that told me, immediately, that his concern in this moment ran considerably deeper than simple surprise, past Diane Castellan, who was staring at me with a particular wide-eyed recalculation of someone realizing they had just spent 20 minutes speaking to the housewife, without any idea who they were actually addressing. I reached the stage and stood beside Priya, looking out over a ballroom of 200 people, many of whom I had personally decided, over the years, deserved a chance nobody else was willing to give them. I found Marcus's face in the crowd, still frozen in his seat, and I began to speak. 10 years ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system, I sat in my father's study and told him I wanted to build something that judged people on their work rather than their pedigree, their connections, or the assumptions other people made about them before ever giving them a real chance. I built Meridian Circle specifically so that every decision I made would stand entirely on its own merit, separate from any name, any reputation, any story anyone else wanted to tell about who I was or what I was capable of. I paused, letting my eyes move across the room, and I found Grant's face again, still rigid, sweat beginning to bead visibly at his hairline despite the ballroom's controlled temperature. I've spent this year, along with my team, reviewing the portfolio companies nominated for tonight's Visionary Award, the same rigorous review we apply to every investment decision this foundation makes. And I want to be honest with this room, because honesty has always been the actual foundation of everything Meridian Circle stands for, even when honesty is uncomfortable. I took a slow breath. Earlier this evening, our due diligence team flagged significant discrepancies in the financial reporting submitted by tonight's leading nominee, Belcore Analytics. The murmur that moved through the ballroom this time was considerably less polite than the earlier applause. I watched Grant's face drain of nearly all remaining color. I watched Marcus's expression shift from confusion about my identity to a new, sharper kind of alarm as he processed what I had just said about his own company. I'm not going to detail the specifics of an ongoing investigation in front of this room tonight, I continued. But I want every founder in this ballroom to understand something clearly. This foundation was built on the belief that genuine, honest work deserves real recognition, precisely because that kind of work is rare and valuable and too often overlooked. It was never built to celebrate manufactured numbers, inflated projections, or growth stories that don't survive basic scrutiny. Tonight's Visionary Award will not be presented to Belcore Analytics. Our team will be reaching out directly to the company's leadership, and separately to the firm currently considering an acquisition, to ensure that accurate information guides whatever decisions come next. The ballroom had gone almost entirely silent now, 200 people absorbing, in real time, the collapse of what many of them had assumed, only minutes earlier, was a settled outcome for the evening. I looked directly at Marcus, sitting frozen at our table, and for a moment, in front of everyone, I allowed myself to say one more thing, not as the anonymous founder of Meridian Circle, but simply as his wife. I also want to say something less official, I continued, my voice softening slightly, though it still carried clearly through the room. 10 years of quiet work taught me a great deal about how easily brilliant people get overlooked simply because someone else decided, without ever asking a real question, that they understood the full measure of who that person was. Tonight, I was introduced to some of the most important people in this industry as, and I'm quoting directly, just the housewife. I think it's worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, in a room full of people who claim to value looking past surface assumptions to find real substance underneath. I did not look at Marcus again as I said it. I did not need to. I could feel, from the stage, the particular stillness of a man realizing, in front of everyone whose respect he had spent years cultivating, exactly how badly he had misjudged the woman he had built a life beside. I stepped down from the stage to applause that started slowly and then built, genuine and sustained, from founders in that room who understood, immediately and personally, exactly what it meant to have your real value hidden or dismissed by people who never bothered to look closely enough to find it. The ceremony continued, awkwardly, through several other award presentations, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely, every conversation now colored by the twin revelations of the evening. The anonymous founder finally revealed, and the leading company's award publicly withdrawn under a cloud of financial impropriety. I did not return to our table. I stood near the stage's edge with Rosalind and Priya, fielding a steady stream of founders and investors who approached, one after another, to introduce themselves properly for the first time, many of them telling me, in various forms, some version of the same sentiment, that they had spent years wondering who was actually behind the fund that had changed their professional lives, and that meeting me now, finally, felt like closing a loop they had not realized was still open. Marcus found me nearly an hour later, after most of the ceremony's remaining program had concluded, his face still pale, his expensive new suit looking, somehow, less impressive than it had at the start of the evening. Al. His voice was hoarse. I need to talk to you, privately. Right now. We found a small side room off the main ballroom, a quiet space usually reserved for the foundation staff, and Marcus closed the door behind us, standing there for a long moment before he finally spoke. You're Eleanor Voss, he said, as though saying it aloud might make it easier to believe. You've been running Meridian Circle this entire time. For our entire marriage. For longer than that, actually. I founded it 3 years before we met. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the particular crack of a man realizing the ground beneath an entire relationship had just shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. I studied him for a long moment before answering, considering, seriously, how much of the truth he deserved in this particular moment, given everything else unraveling around us. I told myself, for years, that I wanted to be loved for who I was rather than what I controlled. That's true, as far as it goes. But I think the deeper truth, Marcus, is that somewhere along the way, I stopped believing you would actually be curious enough to find out, even if I gave you every opportunity to ask. And tonight proved that belief wasn't unfounded. That's not fair. If you'd just told me. I did give you chances, Marcus. Small ones, over years. I never actively lied about my career. I simply let you believe whatever version was easiest, because you never once asked a real question that would have required me to correct it. And tonight, in front of Diane Castellan and half the industry, you introduced me as just the housewife. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was 4 years of exactly how you actually see me, finally said out loud where I couldn't pretend not to hear it. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the room's folding chairs, his head in his hands. I don't even know what to say to that. I don't know how to defend it, honestly, because you're right. I've been saying some version of that sentence for 2 years, and I never once thought about what it actually meant, or what it might be doing to you every time I said it. There's something else you need to know, I said, and something in my tone must have registered as significant, because he looked up immediately. The discrepancies our team found in Belcor's financials. Marcus, I need to know honestly right now how much you knew about what Grant has been doing. His face went through a complicated series of expressions, and for one terrible moment, I genuinely did not know what he was going to say. I didn't know the specifics, Marcus said slowly. I swear to you, Elle, I didn't know he was fabricating actual numbers. But I knew the growth projections he was presenting to the acquiring firm felt aggressive, faster than what our internal dashboards were showing me. I asked him about it once, a few months ago, and he told me he was using a different methodology that better reflected our true growth trajectory, accounting for pipeline deals that hadn't fully closed yet. I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant we were about to close the biggest deal of my career. I think, if I'm being honest with myself the way you're being honest with me right now, some part of me chose not to look too closely, because looking too closely might have meant slowing down at exactly the moment I wanted, more than almost anything, to finally win. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the particular exhausted clarity of a night that had revealed, in the span of a few hours, the full truth about both the man I had married and the business he had built. We're going to need to sort through all of this properly, I said finally. Both things. What happened between us tonight, and what Grant has actually done to your company's financial integrity. But Marcus, I want you to understand something clearly before we do either of those things. I am not going to pretend the fund quietly making Belcor's acquisition offer collapse under scrutiny is some kind of trick to punish you personally. It's the same standard I apply to every company Meridian Circle touches, including the one I anonymously saved from bankruptcy 4 years before we ever got engaged. Marcus's head snapped up. What did you just say? I told him then, standing in that small side room while the ceremony's closing remarks drifted faintly through the closed door, the full story of the emergency bridge investment that had saved his company during its darkest 6 weeks, the investment he had spent years believing came from a mysterious angel investor connected loosely to his original seed round, an investment that had, in fact, come directly from me, structured carefully through Meridian Circle's standard proxy process, specifically so he would never know. You saved my company, Marcus said slowly, the full weight of it settling over him. Years before we got married. And you never told me. Not once, in 7 years. No, I admitted. I didn't. And I think, standing here now, I understand exactly why that was a mistake, the same category of mistake as everything you did tonight, just wearing a different disguise. I told myself I was protecting the purity of what we had, letting you believe your success was entirely your own. But really, Elle, I was protecting myself from ever having to be fully seen either, hiding behind the same convenient invisibility I've built my entire career around. We've both, in our own ways, spent years choosing comfortable half-truths over the harder work of actually knowing each other completely. We sat in that small room for a long time after that, working through the layers of what the evening had exposed, not just about Grant's fraud, or about Marcus's careless dismissal of me in front of important people, but about the fundamental architecture of a marriage built, on both sides, on strategic omission rather than full honesty. The following weeks unfolded with the particular grinding intensity of a genuine corporate crisis. Meridian Circle's forensic accounting team, working alongside outside auditors retained specifically for the investigation, uncovered the full scope of Grant's manipulation over the course of roughly 10 days of intensive review. Grant had been artificially inflating Belcor's customer retention metrics for nearly 18 months, fabricating 3 enterprise contracts entirely and significantly overstating the terms of 2 others, all in service of building a growth narrative aggressive enough to justify both the acquisition offer currently on the table and, our investigators eventually discovered, a substantial personal bonus structure Grant had negotiated for himself contingent specifically on the deal closing at its currently inflated valuation. The following weeks unfolded with the particular grinding intensity of a genuine corporate crisis. Meridian Circle's forensic accounting team, working alongside outside auditors retained specifically for the investigation, uncovered the full scope of Grant's manipulation over the course of roughly 10 days of intensive review. Grant had been artificially inflating Belcor's customer retention metrics for nearly 18 months, fabricating 3 enterprise contracts entirely and significantly overstating the terms of 2 others, all in service of building a growth narrative aggressive enough to justify both the acquisition offer currently on the table and, our investigators eventually discovered, a substantial personal bonus structure Grant had negotiated for himself contingent specifically on the deal closing at its currently inflated valuation. I sat in on nearly every one of those 10 days of review, not as Marcus's wife, but in my formal capacity as the fund's founder, working alongside a forensic accountant named Priscilla Nakamura, whose reputation for unraveling exactly this kind of corporate deception had made her one of Meridian Circle's most trusted outside consultants for nearly 6 years. Priscilla walked me through the discrepancies methodically, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, showing me the gap between what Belcor's internal systems recorded and what Grant had presented externally, a gap that widened steadily over 18 months in a pattern too consistent to be explained by simple accounting error or aggressive but honest methodology. "Look at this," Priscilla said one afternoon, pulling up a specific contract flagged in the acquisition due diligence package, supposedly a 2-year enterprise agreement with a mid-sized manufacturing conglomerate worth nearly $4 million in annual recurring revenue. This contract doesn't exist anywhere in Belcor's actual signed agreements folder. It exists as a signed PDF in the diligence package Grant sent to the acquiring firm's counsel, but the signature block doesn't match any authorized signatory at the supposed client company, and when my team called the client's actual procurement department directly, they had no record of any agreement with Belcor whatsoever. "He fabricated an entire contract from scratch," I said, feeling the particular cold clarity that came whenever a suspicion was confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. "At least one entirely, yes. The other 2 are real relationships, genuinely existing customers, but the terms have been substantially overstated, contract values inflated by roughly 60% above what the actual signed agreements specify. It's sophisticated enough that a less thorough review might have missed it entirely, especially under the time pressure of a fast-moving acquisition process, which I suspect is exactly why Grant felt confident enough to attempt it." I brought Marcus into a private meeting with Priscilla and Sandra Delgado 4 days into the review, once the pattern had become undeniable, and watched him absorb the full documentation with an expression that moved slowly from disbelief through anger and finally into something that looked, to my genuine surprise, like relief. "Part of me wondered," Marcus admitted quietly, staring at the spreadsheet Priscilla had prepared. "Not this specific thing, not fabricated contracts. But the growth felt too clean, too fast, especially over the last 2 quarters. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that I should trust the person I'd built this company alongside for 4 years. I think honestly, some part of me didn't want to look too closely, because looking too closely might have meant slowing down the acquisition I wanted so badly to close. That's a familiar feeling for me too, this week, I said quietly, and he understood exactly what I meant. Grant arrived at the meeting with the particular brittle confidence of a man who had spent the previous week rehearsing denials, and within the first 20 minutes, watching Sandra lay out the forensic accounting team's documentation piece by piece, I watched that confidence crack apart entirely. "These numbers are wrong," Grant said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. "Your team doesn't understand our accounting methodology. We've always used forward-looking pipeline projections to represent." "Grant," Sandra interrupted, her tone even and precise, "we have internal emails between you and 2 members of your finance team explicitly discussing how to present pipeline deals as fully executed contracts specifically for the acquisition due diligence package. This isn't a methodology dispute. This is fabrication, and we have the documentation to prove it conclusively." Grant's eyes moved around the table, landing briefly on each of us, calculating, the way I imagined he had calculated 1,000 times over the last 18 months, whether the next lie might hold together long enough to matter.
Fine,
he said finally, his shoulders dropping slightly. "The Meridian Fabrics contract, I'll admit that one got ahead of itself. We were in advanced negotiations. I genuinely believed it would close within the quarter, and I made a judgment call to represent it as executed slightly early. That's aggressive, I'll grant you that, but it's not the crime you're describing." "Grant, the client has no record of any negotiation with Belcor at all," Priscilla said, sliding a printed email exchange across the table. "Their head of procurement confirmed, on a recorded call with my team, that they have never had any commercial discussions with your company in any capacity. This wasn't a deal that got ahead of itself. This is a contract that never existed at any stage, signed with a forged signature block." The room fell silent. Grant's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring down at the table, the particular stillness of a man who has finally run out of angles to argue from. "I did this for the company," Grant said, his voice rising with the specific desperation of a cornered man. "For all of us, Marcus, including you. This deal would have set us both up for life. I was just trying to get us across the finish line. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch a competitor eat into our market share every single quarter while our real numbers crawl along at a fraction of what the board expects? I did what I thought needed to be done to protect the thing we built together. You lied to our board, our employees, and a company about to invest 9 figures based on numbers you knew were false," Marcus said, and I watched, with a complicated mixture of relief and something close to pride, my husband finally choosing honesty over comfortable ambition for what felt like the first time in 2 years. "That's not getting us across a finish line, Grant. That's fraud, and it would have destroyed everything I actually built, the real parts, the parts that didn't need to be lied about, the moment it eventually came out. Which it would have. These things always do. And the bonus structure tied to the deal closing at its current valuation," I added quietly. "That was never disclosed to the board either, was it, Grant? Nearly $2.1 million, contingent specifically on the acquisition closing above a certain threshold. A threshold your fabricated numbers happened to clear by a comfortable margin." Grant did not answer that, which was, in its own way, the clearest answer he could have given. "Here's what happens now," Sandra said, laying out the terms Marcus and Meridian Circles Council had agreed upon in advance. "You're terminated immediately, effective today, for cause. Belcor will be filing a formal disclosure with the acquiring firm's counsel correcting the record entirely. Given the scope of what we've found, we are obligated to refer this matter to securities regulators, and I'd strongly recommend retaining your own independent counsel before that process begins." Grant left the building that afternoon escorted by building security, a formality Marcus insisted on, not out of cruelty, but because, as he told me quietly afterward, he no longer trusted what Grant might attempt to access or alter on his way out. The confrontation with Grant happened 8 days after the award ceremony, in Belcour's own conference room, with Marcus, myself, Rosalind representing Meridian Circle's formal interests as the company's largest early investor, and Sandra Delgado, outside counsel. Marcus had retained the moment the scope of the fraud became clear. Grant arrived at the meeting with the particular brittle confidence of a man who had spent the previous week rehearsing denials, and within the first 20 minutes, watching Sandra lay out the forensic accounting team's documentation piece by piece, I watched that confidence crack apart entirely. "These numbers are wrong," Grant said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. "Your team doesn't understand our accounting methodology. We've always used forward-looking pipeline projections to represent." "Grant," Sandra interrupted, her tone even and precise, "we have internal emails between you and 2 members of your finance team explicitly discussing how to present pipeline deals as fully executed contracts specifically for the acquisition due diligence package. This isn't a methodology dispute. This is fabrication, and we have the documentation to prove it conclusively." Grant's face went through the same devastating collapse I had watched happen to Preston Cole months earlier in an entirely different conference room, the particular unraveling of a person realizing, in real time, that the careful architecture of their deception has finally caught up with them completely. "I did this for the company," Grant said, his voice rising with the specific desperation of a cornered man. "For all of us, Marcus, including you. This deal would have set us both up for life. I was just trying to get us across the finish line. You lied to our board, our employees, and a company about to invest 9 figures based on numbers you knew were false," Marcus said, and I watched, with a complicated mixture of relief and something close to pride, my husband finally choosing honesty over comfortable ambition for what felt like the first time in 2 years. "That's not getting us across a finish line, Grant. That's fraud, and it would have destroyed everything I actually built, the real parts, the parts that didn't need to be lied about, the moment it eventually came out. Which it would have. These things always do." The acquisition collapsed within the week, once accurate financial disclosures were provided to the acquiring firm's counsel, though Sandra worked carefully to ensure Belcour's genuine underlying value, considerable even without Grant's inflated projections, remained clearly documented and separately understood. Grant was terminated immediately, and following a lengthy investigation by securities regulators, ultimately reached a settlement that included substantial financial penalties and a permanent bar from serving as an officer of any publicly traded company, a considerably softer outcome than criminal prosecution, though one that effectively ended his career in the industry regardless. Belcour Analytics survived, in the end, though considerably humbled, rebuilding its investor relationships around accurate numbers and a corrected growth narrative that, while less dramatic than Grant's fabrications, proved durable enough over the following year to attract a smaller but entirely legitimate acquisition offer from a different firm. One that Marcus ultimately accepted at a valuation reflecting the company's genuine, honestly earned worth. Marcus and I spent the months following the award ceremony in the difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding a marriage that had revealed, under sudden pressure, exactly how much distance had grown between the people we presented to each other and the people we actually were underneath. It would be simple, and perhaps satisfying in a narrative sense, to say that everything resolved neatly, that Marcus transformed overnight into a man who fully saw and celebrated me, that the years of just the housewife evaporated the moment the truth came out on that stage. The truth was slower and harder than that, built through months of genuinely uncomfortable conversations, through Marcus attending, without prompting, several Meridian Circle founder events specifically to understand the work I had built, through both of us relearning how to ask each other real questions rather than accepting the comfortable, incomplete answers that had defined the earlier years of our marriage. "I keep thinking about all the rooms I put you in over the years," Marcus told me one evening, several months after the ceremony, sitting across from me at our kitchen table. "All the times I introduced you as some smaller version of who you actually are, and I never even noticed I was doing it, because it was easier than actually finding out who you'd become while I wasn't paying close enough attention. I let you do it, Marcus. For a long time. I have to own that part too. Maybe. But you letting me do it doesn't erase me doing it. I want to be someone who asks real questions from now on, even when the easy answer would be more comfortable." There were nights, in that first difficult stretch after the ceremony, when the conversation grew considerably harder than that, when old resentments surfaced that neither of us had fully realized we were still carrying. I told him, more than once, exactly how it felt to hear the phrase, "just the housewife," repeated across years of dinners and industry functions, how each repetition had chipped away, almost imperceptibly, at the part of me that used to believe he saw the full shape of who I was. He told me, in turn, about the specific pressure of building something in an industry obsessed with visible confidence, about how easy it had become to perform a simplified version of our marriage because the performance required less explanation than the truth. Neither of our honesty excused the other's choices, and we both, slowly, learned to sit with that discomfort rather than rushing past it toward an easier resolution. We are still working on it, honestly, in the ordinary, unglamorous way most real repair actually happens, not through one dramatic reveal, but through hundreds of small choices afterward, choices about whether to ask the harder question, whether to introduce someone honestly even when the honest version is more complicated than the convenient one. A year after that award ceremony, Meridian Circle held its 11th annual gala, and this time, I attended not as an anonymous guest standing at the edges of a room I had built, but as the foundation's publicly known founder, standing on stage to open the evening myself. I looked out over a ballroom filled with founders who had spent the last year learning my name, learning the actual story of the work I had done quietly for a decade, and I thought about the woman who had stood in a corner near the coat check exactly 1 year earlier, absorbing a casual dismissal from the person who was supposed to know her best of anyone. I announced, that night, the launch of a new initiative within Meridian Circle specifically designed to identify and fund founders who had been persistently overlooked or underestimated by traditional investors, particularly women whose expertise had been dismissed or diminished by the people closest to them. Precisely the pattern I had lived through myself for years before finally choosing to stand in the light I had spent a decade building for other people. A year after that award ceremony, Meridian Circle held its 11th annual gala, and this time, I attended not as an anonymous guest standing at the edges of a room I had built, but as the foundation's publicly known founder, standing on stage to open the evening myself. I looked out over a ballroom filled with founders who had spent the last year learning my name, learning the actual story of the work I had done quietly for a decade, and I thought about the woman who had stood in a corner near the coat check exactly 1 year earlier, absorbing a casual dismissal from the person who was supposed to know her best of anyone. The months between those two ceremonies had been harder than any single dramatic confrontation could ever fully capture. Diane Castellan, to her credit, had called me personally within a week of the reveal, not to apologize exactly, since she had done nothing wrong beyond simply believing what Marcus told her, but to ask, with genuine curiosity, whether Meridian Circle might consider co-investing on a healthcare technology deal her fund was structuring. Our working relationship over the following year became one of the more professionally satisfying partnerships of my career, built entirely on the substance of shared deals rather than any lingering awkwardness from the night we first properly met. Grant's story unfolded publicly over the following 10 months, his securities fraud settlement covered in enough industry press that his name became, much like Preston Cole's had become in an entirely different story I'd heard about secondhand through a friend at another fund, a cautionary tale whispered at industry events about the specific dangers of prioritizing a deal's closing over its integrity. Several trade publications ran lengthy pieces dissecting exactly how the fabricated contracts had nearly slipped through a 9-figure acquisition, and more than one of those articles cited Meridian Circle's due diligence process as the reason the fraud had been caught before real damage was done, a level of public credit the fund had never actively sought but which, I noticed, did nothing to hurt the flood of new founder applications that arrived in the months that followed. I did not take particular satisfaction in watching his downfall unfold, though I would be lying if I claimed to feel nothing at all watching a man who had knowingly endangered honest investors, employees, and the acquiring firm's shareholders finally face consequences proportional to the risk he had created. Belcor's rebuilding process, by contrast, gave me a genuine and unexpected kind of satisfaction. Marcus spent the months following Grant's termination doing the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding investor trust around numbers that were smaller than what Grant had fabricated, but entirely real. He personally called every major customer to verify contract terms directly, hired an outside compliance officer with no prior relationship to the company to review all future financial disclosures, and, in a decision that surprised me more than almost anything else that year, insisted on personally presenting Belcor's corrected numbers to the board himself, rather than delegating the uncomfortable conversation to anyone else. I used to think leadership meant always having the confident answer, Marcus told me one evening, several months into the rebuilding process. I'm starting to understand it might actually mean being willing to stand in front of people and tell them the uncomfortable truth, even when a comfortable lie would go over so much more easily in the moment. I watched him grow, in fits and starts, into a version of himself that more closely resembled the unpolished, genuinely enthusiastic founder I had first met at that industry mixer 7 years earlier, before 2 years of chasing recognition had slowly sanded away the parts of him that made room for other people's complexity. It was not a perfect transformation, and there were setbacks, evenings when old habits crept back in, when he introduced me to a new business contact with a vague, incomplete description before catching himself and correcting the record properly. But the corrections came, consistently, and over time, they became the pattern rather than the exception. Marcus and I spent the months following the award ceremony in the difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding a marriage that had revealed, under sudden pressure, exactly how much distance had grown between the people we presented to each other and the people we actually were underneath. It would be simple, and perhaps satisfying in a narrative sense, to say that everything resolved neatly, that Marcus transformed overnight into a man who fully saw and celebrated me, that the years of just the housewife evaporated the moment the truth came out on that stage. The truth was slower and harder than that, built through months of genuinely uncomfortable conversations, through Marcus attending, without prompting, several Meridian Circle founder events specifically to understand the work I had built, through both of us relearning how to ask each other real questions rather than accepting the comfortable, incomplete answers that had defined the earlier years of our marriage. I also spent that year building something new for myself, separate from both my marriage and the daily operations of Meridian Circle's existing portfolio, a mentorship program specifically designed to pair experienced founders with people just beginning to build something of their own, particularly people who did not come from backgrounds that made access to capital or credibility easy to come by. I named the program, after considerable internal debate, the Voss Fellowship, choosing finally to attach my own name to something publicly, a small but meaningful departure from a decade of careful anonymity. The first cohort of the Voss Fellowship included 14 founders, among them a young woman named Talia Reyes who had spent 3 years being told by investor after investor that her supply chain logistics startup was too niche and not exciting enough to justify serious funding, the same kind of dismissal I recognized immediately that had defined my own professional invisibility for years before I built a structure specifically designed to bypass it. I met with Talia personally, something I rarely did for individual founders given the scale of Meridian Circle's broader portfolio, and I told her honestly that the gap between what she had actually built and what investors were willing to see in her was not a reflection of her work's quality, but a reflection of exactly how much unearned advantage still shaped who got taken seriously in rooms most people never got invited into at all. How did you learn to stop caring what people assumed about you? Talia asked me during one of our early mentorship sessions. I'm not sure I ever fully learned that, I admitted honestly. I think what I actually learned much later than I should have is that not caring what people assume and quietly correcting the record when it matters are two entirely different skills. I spent years thinking staying silent about being underestimated made me strong. It mostly just made me invisible in exactly the moments visibility would have helped me most. I announced, that night at the 11th annual gala, the official public launch of the Voss Fellowship, and the response from the ballroom, a standing ovation that lasted considerably longer than the applause following any other award presentation that evening, told me everything I needed to know about how many people in that room had spent years quietly carrying some version of the same story I had lived through myself. Marcus sat in the audience that night in the third row, and when I finished speaking, he was the first person on his feet, applauding, and for the first time in longer than I could comfortably admit, I felt no complicated undercurrent beneath his pride, only the straightforward, uncomplicated support I had always wanted from him and had, for years, quietly decided I would settle for less than. My father attended that 11th gala as well, quietly, from a seat near the back, The same kind of unassuming placement I had chosen for myself for a decade before circumstances finally pushed me toward the stage. He found me afterward, near the same coat check corner where Rosalind had once delivered the news that changed the entire trajectory of my evening a year earlier, and he studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Your mother would have loved this," he said finally. "Watching you stand up there tonight. Not because of the fund or the money or any of it. Because you finally stopped making yourself smaller to keep the peace in rooms that never deserved that kind of sacrifice from you in the first place. It took me a long time to get here, Dad." "It usually does," he said. "The people who figure this out quickly are rare, and honestly, I'm not sure I entirely trust them when I meet them. The rest of us have to learn it the hard way, usually in front of an audience we never wanted watching in the first place." He smiled, the particular quiet smile he reserved for moments he considered genuinely significant. "I'm proud of you, Eleanor. I have been for a long time. I just don't think you were always in a place to actually hear it." We often build entire identities around the comfortable assumptions other people make about us, telling ourselves that staying quiet protects something valuable, that our worth does not require anyone else's recognition to be real. There is genuine wisdom in not needing external validation to know your own value. But there is a difference between quiet confidence and active disappearance, between choosing privacy and accepting erasure, and it took me a decade, and one devastating sentence spoken in front of 200 strangers, to finally understand exactly where that line had been sitting the entire time. The truth about who we are does not diminish simply because someone else, even someone we love, decides to describe us smaller than we actually are. Eventually, if you have built something real underneath the surface, the truth finds its way to the stage, whether or not you ever asked it to. Take a moment today to consider the rooms in your own life where someone has described you smaller than you actually are, and ask yourself honestly whether you have been quietly allowing it. The truth about your own worth was never actually up for negotiation, no matter how comfortable the smaller version might have seemed to everyone standing around you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.